A cold-hearted millionaire CEO hired a nanny over the phone, but when he saw her dancing with his paralyzed daughter, he broke down in tears. Before we dive in, this video is traveling across time zones right now. Share what season you're experiencing where you live. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the 52nd floor, reflecting Richard Blackwood's steel-gray eyes as he surveyed his technological empire sprawling across Boston's skyline. At 42, he commanded respect through precision. Every meeting scheduled to the minute, every decision calculated, every emotion buried beneath layers of corporate armor. "Sir, the quarterly reports are ready for your review," Margaret announced. From the doorway, her voice barely penetrating the fortress of silence he'd built around himself. She'd worked alongside him for 15 years, witnessing his transformation from a warm family man into this cold architect of success. Richard nodded without looking up, his fingers dancing across spreadsheets that meant everything and nothing. 2 years had passed since the accident that shattered more than bones and spinal cords. It had frozen his heart solid. The elevator ride to his penthouse felt eternal, each floor marking another layer of responsibility he carried alone. His mansion stood like a monument to his pain, its pristine hallways echoing with memories he refused to acknowledge. In the medical wing he'd constructed, 7-year-old Emma sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring through bulletproof windows at a world she could no longer run through. Her legs, once strong enough to leap across ballet stages, now lay still beneath designer blankets. "How was school today?" Richard asked, his voice professionally distant even with his own daughter. Emma's silence spoke volumes. She'd stopped, answering weeks ago, retreating into herself just as he had retreated into work. As night fell over Boston, Richard stood watching Emma sleep, her breathing the only sound in their tomb of a home. Somewhere beneath his frozen exterior, love burned like trapped fire, desperate to break free but terrified of the vulnerability it would bring. The weight of tomorrow's responsibilities pressed against his chest as he closed her door, unaware. That change was already calling Margaret's phone, ready to shatter his perfectly controlled world. The morning light filtered through the mansion's tall windows as Richard reviewed termination paperwork for yet another caregiver. 5 in 2 years. A record that spoke volumes about his impossible standards and Emma's growing withdrawal from the world. "She lasted 3 weeks this time," Margaret observed, placing the resignation letter on his desk. "That's actually an improvement." Richard's jaw tightened. The latest caregiver had quit after Emma refused to speak for an entire week, communicating only through pointed stares and strategic silence. He couldn't blame the woman. Emma's defiance had become an art form. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," Richard muttered, signing the papers with sharp strokes. "I provide detailed instructions, competitive salary, excellent benefits." Margaret sat across from him, her maternal instincts overriding corporate protocol. "Richard, that child needs more than instructions. She needs proper medical care and structured rehabilitation," he interrupted, the same speech he'd given 5 times before, not emotional coddling that interferes with her recovery. But deep down, Richard knew the truth. Each departing caregiver took with them a piece of Emma's hope, and his own guilt grew heavier with every resignation letter. The accident haunted his dreams. That rainy Saturday returning from their weekend at the lake house, Claire laughing at something Emma had said from the back seat, the truck running the red light. "Sir, we need to try a different approach," Margaret pressed gently. "Perhaps someone with specialized experience in pediatric care?" Richard stared at the family photo on his desk, the last one taken before their world collapsed. Claire's arms wrapped around both of them, Emma's ballet shoes dangling from tiny fingers, all 3 faces glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed impossible now. "Find someone qualified," he finally conceded, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they follow my protocols exactly. No exceptions." Margaret nodded, already mentally preparing for the most important interview of her career. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the final number on her carefully curated list. 23 interviews in 3 days had yielded nothing but disappointment, caregivers who wilted under Richard's demands or lacked the specialized skills Emma desperately needed. "Hello, this is Vanessa Rodriguez," came a warm voice that immediately stood apart from the others. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm calling about the pediatric care position with the Blackwood family," Margaret began, her practiced speech ready. But something in Vanessa's tone made her pause. "Tell me about Emma," Vanessa said simply, bypassing the usual salary negotiations and scheduling discussions that had dominated previous calls. Margaret found herself describing not just Emma's medical needs, but the little girl who used to pirouette through these same hallways, who once filled the mansion with laughter and music. As she spoke, she heard Vanessa taking notes, not just medical details, but emotional ones. "I have my nursing degree with a specialization in pediatric rehabilitation," Vanessa explained. "But more importantly, I understand that healing involves more than just the body. My mother was a physical therapist who taught me that hope can be as powerful as any medicine." At 28, Vanessa had already worked with dozens of children facing impossible challenges. Her voice carried a confidence that wasn't arrogant, but grounded in genuine experience and compassion. "Mr. Blackwood is very particular about protocols," Margaret warned carefully. "I respect the need for structure," Vanessa replied. "But within that structure, there's usually room for small miracles." Margaret's heart quickened. This was different. This was what Emma needed. "When can you start?" she asked, making the decision Richard had unknowingly entrusted to her. 3 hours later, Vanessa Rodriguez walked through the front door of the Blackwood mansion, her nursing bag in one hand and a guitar case in the other, ready to challenge the fortress of silence that had imprisoned a broken family. Richard's leather-bound manual hit the marble kitchen counter with the weight of commandments carved in stone. 47 pages of meticulously documented procedures, schedules, and medical protocols that had taken him months to perfect. "Physical therapy sessions begin at 9:15 precisely," he explained to Vanessa, his finger tracing the laminated timeline. "Dr. Harrison's exercises must be followed exactly as prescribed. No deviations, no creative interpretations." Vanessa nodded respectfully, though her eyes occasionally drifted toward the living room where Emma sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring at nothing. The 7-year-old hadn't acknowledged the new caregiver's presence beyond a single measuring glance. "Meal times are non-negotiable," Richard continued, his voice growing more rigid with each rule. "Emma's nutritional requirements are calculated to support her recovery. No snacks between scheduled times, no exceptions for preferences." "What about music therapy?" Vanessa asked carefully, noting the complete absence of anything creative in the extensive manual. "Many pediatric rehabilitation programs find it beneficial for Emma needs to focus on regaining function, not entertaining herself," Richard cut her off sharply. Dr. Harrison was very clear about avoiding distractions from her physical therapy goals. Vanessa's trained eye caught something Richard had missed. A small music player hastily shoved under Emma's wheelchair cushion, its earphone cord barely visible. The little girl's fingers unconsciously tapped against her leg brace in a rhythm only she could hear. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Vanessa agreed, filing away this crucial piece of information. "I'll follow your protocols exactly." That evening, as Richard worked late in his study, Vanessa observed the dinner ritual from the kitchen doorway. Father and daughter sat at opposite ends of a table built for 12, eating in silence, so complete it felt oppressive. Emma picked at her medically approved meal while Richard's attention remained fixed on his tablet, reviewing tomorrow's meetings. When Emma wheeled herself to bed without a single word exchanged, Vanessa made herself a quiet promise. Within these rigid rules, she would find cracks where hope could grow. The physical therapy room had been designed with clinical precision, parallel bars, exercise mats, and medical equipment arranged like instruments in an operating theater. But on her third day, Vanessa made a subtle addition to Richard's approved routine. "Let's try those arm-strengthening exercises," she suggested to Emma, who approached therapy with the enthusiasm of someone facing dental surgery. "Dr. Harrison wants 15 repetitions, right?" Emma nodded reluctantly, beginning the mechanical movements that had become her prison sentence. Halfway through the session, Vanessa casually reached for a small Bluetooth speaker she'd hidden in her therapy bag. Classical music began flowing softly through the room. Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, the same piece that had once filled this house with the sound of tiny feet practicing grand jetés. Emma's movements faltered. Her eyes, vacant for weeks, suddenly sparked with recognition. "This is still therapy," Vanessa said gently, noting the immediate change in Emma's posture. "We're just giving your muscles something beautiful to move with." For the first time since the accident, Emma completed her exercises without complaint. More importantly, Vanessa caught her humming, barely audible, but unmistakably there. That evening, as Vanessa helped Emma prepare for bed, she discovered the hidden music player she'd spotted days earlier. "You loved to dance, didn't you?" Vanessa asked softly, examining the device filled with ballet performances and classical compositions. Emma's fingers tightened around the player, fear flashing across her face. Fear of having this last connection to her former self taken away. "Your secret's safe with me," Vanessa whispered, gently tucking the device back under Emma's pillow. "But maybe tomorrow we could listen together during therapy. I think your mom would want you to keep dancing, even if it looks different now." Emma's first words in 3 weeks came as a whisper. She used to say dancing was flying with your feet on the ground. Vanessa smiled, tucking the covers around Emma's shoulders. Tomorrow she would show this brave little girl that sometimes you could fly even when your feet couldn't touch the ground at all. The canceled merger meeting should have been Richard's first clue that fate was orchestrating something beyond his control. His driver had barely pulled into the circular driveway when the sound stopped him cold. Laughter, Emma's laughter, bright and genuine, echoing from the therapy room like music he'd forgotten existed. Richard moved toward the sound as if drawn by a siren's call, his briefcase forgotten in the foyer. Through the partially open door, he witnessed something that defied every medical protocol he'd memorized and every fear he'd harbored. Vanessa stood behind Emma's wheelchair, her strong arms gently lifting the 7-year-old to her feet. Emma's legs, weakened but not lifeless, supported her weight with Vanessa's careful guidance. Together they swayed to Debussy's Clair de Lune, Emma's arms wrapped around Vanessa's neck, her face radiant with joy Richard hadn't seen since before the accident. 1, 2, 3, and turn, Vanessa whispered, supporting Emma as they moved in a slow, careful circle. "Feel how your back muscles are working? This is therapy disguised as magic." Emma giggled, actually giggled, as they spun. "I feel like I'm floating." Richard's hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white. Tears he'd forbidden himself for 2 years suddenly carved warm paths down his cheeks. This was his daughter. Not the broken, silent child who'd haunted his house, but the Emma who'd once filled every room with music and movement. The moment stretched like a suspended note until Emma spotted him over Vanessa's shoulder. "Daddy." Vanessa turned slowly, Emma still in her arms, her face immediately shifting from joy to resignation. She'd been caught breaking every rule in Richard's sacred manual, and she fully expected to be dismissed on the spot, but Richard couldn't speak. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching his daughter's face cycle through confusion, fear, and finally, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this beautiful moment wouldn't be destroyed by his rigid need for control. The music continued playing, filling the silence with possibilities neither adult had dared to imagine. The morning air crackled with tension as Richard paced his study, the manual lying open before him like evidence in a trial. Vanessa sat across from his desk, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the storm brewing in his gray eyes. "You deliberately violated protocol," Richard began, his voice controlled but dangerous. "Emma could have been injured. Her spine is still healing, her muscle strength compromised. What you did was reckless and documented," Vanessa interrupted quietly, sliding a leather journal across the mahogany surface. Every movement, every exercise, every improvement. Richard's accusations faltered as he opened the journal. Pages of meticulous notes detailed Emma's progress. Increased core strength, improved posture, enhanced coordination. Graphs tracking her range of motion. Photographs showing proper support techniques. even medical references citing the benefits of music therapy in pediatric rehabilitation. I consulted with Dr. Harrison before implementing any movement exercises. Vanessa continued, her voice steady but passionate. Everything we did falls within his approved parameters for Emma's current stage of recovery. The only difference is we gave those exercises meaning. Richard studied the documentation, his analytical mind recognizing the thoroughness that rivaled his own obsessive record-keeping. But the dancing is supported movement therapy disguised as joy, Vanessa said firmly. Look at the data, Mr. Blackwood. Emma completed 45 minutes of exercises yesterday without a single complaint. Her previous sessions averaged 12 minutes before she shut down completely. For the first time in weeks, Richard listened without interrupting. The numbers didn't lie. Emma's compliance had increased 300%. Her engagement was measurably higher, and most importantly, she was speaking again. I know you think structure means eliminating risk, Vanessa said softly. But sometimes the biggest risk is letting fear paralyze us completely. Emma isn't just a collection of symptoms to manage. She's a little girl who lost her ability to dance. Giving her a different way to move isn't abandoning her therapy. It's saving her soul. Richard closed the journal slowly, his world shifting on its axis as he realized that maybe, just maybe, control and healing weren't mutually exclusive after all. The text message arrived while Richard was negotiating a multi-million-dollar acquisition, his phone buzzing insistently during the most crucial moment of the meeting. Taking Emma to Adaptive Recreation Park for outdoor therapy session. We'll document everything. Vanessa. But Richard's phone had been on silent for 3 hours when he finally saw the message at 4:47 p.m. Panic consumed him like wildfire. The park wasn't on his approved list. Emma had never been in public since the accident. Too many variables, too many risks, too much beyond his control. You're fired, were the first words out of his mouth when Vanessa wheeled Emma through the front door at 6:15 p.m., both of them glowing from an afternoon of sunshine and laughter. Emma's face crumpled. Daddy, no. Vanessa showed me I could go down the slide by myself and go to your room, Emma, now. The devastating silence that followed felt like a death sentence. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked between her father and the woman who'd given her back pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. Mr. Blackwood, please let me explain. Vanessa began. You took my daughter without authorization. End of discussion. Within an hour, Vanessa's belongings were packed and she was gone, leaving behind only her meticulously documented progress reports and a house that suddenly felt colder than ever. The next week became Richard's personal hell. Emma retreated deeper into herself than ever before, refusing therapy, barely eating, communicating only in hostile stares. Expensive toys went untouched. Gentle encouragement fell on deaf ears. On the 7th night, Emma's sobbing woke Richard at 2:30 a.m. Her legs were locked in painful muscle spasms, her usual medications ineffective against the anxiety-induced tension. The on-call physician's instructions over the phone provided no relief. By 3 a.m., Emma was hyperventilating between screams of pain, and Richard faced a terrifying truth. He was completely powerless to help his own daughter. His hands shaking, he dialed Vanessa's number, praying she would answer and save them both from his catastrophic mistake. Please. Richard's voice cracked through the phone at 3:17 a.m., his composure completely shattered. I don't know what to do. She's in so much pain. Vanessa answered on the first ring, instantly alert. In the background, she could hear Emma's distressed cries, each sound piercing her heart like a blade. Is she having muscle spasms? Vanessa asked, already reaching for her car keys. Yes, but the medication isn't working. The doctor said to monitor her, but she's getting worse, not better. I've tried everything in the manual and… Richard, listen to me carefully, Vanessa interrupted, her nursing training taking control. This isn't just physical pain, it's anxiety manifesting through her body. Get to her room and put me on speaker. Richard stumbled through the mansion's dark hallways, finding Emma curled in her bed, her small body rigid with pain and fear. Emma, sweetheart, it's Vanessa, came the familiar voice through the phone. Can you hear me? Emma's cries softened slightly at the sound. I need you to breathe with me, okay? In through your nose, out through your mouth. Your daddy's going to help. Vanessa guided them through specialized breathing techniques, her voice steady and reassuring despite the 20 miles between them. But when Emma's condition didn't improve after 15 minutes, Richard's voice turned desperate. Vanessa, please, I'm begging you, come here, I can't help her like you can. The admission cost him everything, his pride, his illusion of control, his carefully constructed walls. But Emma needed more than his love. She needed Vanessa's expertise and the emotional connection he'd foolishly severed. 20 minutes later, Vanessa burst through the front door she still had keys to, rushing upstairs to find Richard holding Emma, while tears streamed down his face. Within minutes, Vanessa had Emma's breathing regulated and her muscles relaxing through targeted pressure point therapy and gentle movement exercises that weren't in any manual. They came from her heart. As Emma finally drifted to sleep, Richard realized that saving his daughter meant surrendering his need to control everything and everyone around them. The formal apology came at sunrise, delivered over coffee in the kitchen where Richard's pride had died just hours earlier. His hands shook slightly as he slid the contract across the marble counter. Doubled salary, comprehensive benefits, and something unprecedented. Decision-making. Authority in Emma's care. I'm sorry, he said, the words foreign on his tongue. You were right, and I was. He struggled to find language for his failures. Scared, controlling, wrong. Vanessa studied the contract, but her eyes kept drifting to the man before her, disheveled, vulnerable, and finally admitting what she'd known from day one. Love without trust was just another form of prison. I'll come back, she said quietly. But things have to change. Not just the salary or the benefits. You need to be part of Emma's healing, not just the overseer of it. The transformation began that very afternoon. Richard cleared his schedule for Emma's therapy session, entering the room not as the demanding father with his manual, but as a student willing to learn. Show me, he said simply to Vanessa. For the next hour, Richard watched his daughter work with Vanessa, not just the physical exercises, but the gentle encouragement, the way music transformed mundane movements into something magical, the careful balance between pushing Emma forward and respecting her limits. Your turn, Vanessa announced during the second week, guiding Richard's hands to properly support Emma's torso during standing exercises. Richard's touch was awkward at first, too clinical, too careful. But as Emma giggled at his concentration, something shifted. His hands found their natural rhythm. His voice softened into encouragement rather than instruction. I'm dancing with Daddy, Emma announced proudly as they swayed together, Richard supporting her weight while she moved her arms in graceful arcs. It was the first time since Claire's death that Richard held his daughter close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. The moment lasted only minutes, but it rewrote everything he thought he knew about strength, control, and the courage required to let love lead. That night, Emma fell asleep holding both their hands. The request came, on a Tuesday morning so quietly Richard almost missed it. Emma was finishing her breakfast when she looked up from her wheelchair and asked, Daddy, can I see pictures of Mommy? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. For 2 years, he'd locked away everything that reminded him of Claire. Photo, albums, home videos, even Emma's baby pictures where Claire's radiant smile dominated every frame. The memories were too raw, too dangerous to his carefully constructed emotional armor. Maybe later, sweetheart. He deflected automatically, the same response he'd given dozens of times before. But Vanessa, who was organizing Emma's therapy schedule nearby, looked up from her notes. Actually, that sounds like a wonderful idea. Memories can be powerful medicine too. Richard's jaw tightened. I don't think that's appropriate for her recovery right now. With respect, Mr. Blackwood, Vanessa said gently but firmly. Emma isn't just recovering from a physical injury. She's grieving her mother and the life she used to have. Pretending Claire never existed isn't protecting her. It's preventing her from healing completely. Emma's eyes moved between the adults, hope and fear warring across her young face. Please, Daddy. I promise I won't cry. The promise broke Richard's heart because he realized Emma thought her grief was another burden she needed to carry alone, another emotion she needed to suppress to make his life easier. That afternoon, Richard found himself standing before the locked closet in his study, his hand trembling on the key he hadn't turned in 24 months. Behind that door lay 3 years of documented happiness, photo albums, home videos, Claire's journals, Emma's artwork from before the accident. With Vanessa and Emma watching from the leather sofa, Richard opened the closet and began removing boxes that contained their former life. The first album showed Claire pregnant with Emma, her hands protectively cradled around her growing belly while Richard kissed her cheek. Mommy was beautiful, Emma whispered, touching the plastic-covered photograph with reverent fingers. Page by page, they reconstructed their family history, Claire teaching baby Emma to clap. Emma's first steps captured in a blurry but precious video. Birthday parties, holiday mornings, lazy Sunday afternoons in the garden where Claire would read stories while Emma played in the grass. Then Vanessa discovered something that changed everything, a memory card labeled Emma's dance lessons, age 3 to 5 in Claire's careful handwriting. Should we watch this one? Vanessa asked gently, holding up the small device. Richard's breath caught. These were recordings he'd never seen, videos Claire had made while he was traveling for business. With shaking hands, he inserted the card into his laptop. The screen, filled with their old living room, furniture arranged differently, filled with afternoon sunlight. 3-year-old Emma appeared wearing a tiny pink tutu, her chubby legs barely able to execute the ballet positions Claire was demonstrating. First position, baby girl. Claire's voice filled the room, warm and alive and devastatingly familiar. Remember, dancing isn't about being perfect. It's about expressing the joy in your heart. Emma in the video giggled as she attempted a wobbly plie, and present-day Emma laughed through her tears at her younger self's determination. The videos continued chronologically. Emma at 4, learning simple choreography, at 5, performing, an entire routine she'd created herself. But it was the final video that destroyed Richard's remaining defenses. Claire and 5-year-old Emma danced together to Swan Lake, the same piece Vanessa had been using in therapy. Emma was still learning, still imperfect, but her face glowed with pure happiness as she moved with her mother. "You're going to be such a beautiful dancer," Claire said to the camera as Emma spun in the background. "No matter what happens in life, promise me you'll keep dancing. Even if it looks different than you imagine, promise me you'll find ways to fly." The video ended with Emma hugging Claire, both of them laughing as they collapsed onto the sofa in a tangle of arms and tutus. The silence that followed was heavy with 2 years of suppressed grief. Richard's shoulders began to shake as 24 months of buried pain finally erupted. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside him, raw and desperate and long overdue. Emma wheeled closer to her father, and for the first time since the accident, she was the one offering comfort. "It's okay to cry, Daddy. Vanessa told me that tears are how love leaves our eyes when it's too big for our hearts." Vanessa knelt beside them both, her own eyes wet with tears. Together, the 3 of them grieved properly for the first time, not just for Claire, but for the innocence they'd lost, the future they'd planned, and the family they used to be. But in that shared sorrow, something new was born. Understanding replaced silence. Connection replaced isolation. And Emma finally had permission to remember her mother not as a source of pain, but as the foundation of love that would carry her forward. That evening, they made a decision together. Claire's photos would come out of the closet and back onto the walls where they belonged. Her voice would return to their home through the videos they'd watched together. And Emma would dance again, not to replace what was lost, but to honor what would always remain. The phone call from Dr. Harrison came on a crisp October morning while Richard was reviewing quarterly reports in his study. Emma was in the garden, with Vanessa, practicing supported standing exercises in the autumn sunshine, their laughter drifting through the open windows like music. "Mr. Blackwood, I wanted to discuss Emma's progress and a potential opportunity," Dr. Harrison began, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a physician who'd seen too many disappointments to make promises lightly. Her improvement over the past 3 months has been remarkable, better than anything we projected when we began treatment. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. In the medical world, remarkable was a word doctors used sparingly, and he'd learned to listen carefully when it appeared. The strength she's gained in her core muscles, the increased mobility in her lower extremities, it's opened up possibilities we didn't think we'd have this soon, Dr. Harrison continued. I've been in contact with colleagues at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. They're conducting an experimental treatment program that could potentially help Emma recover some sensation and movement in her legs. The words hung in the air like a prayer Richard was afraid to acknowledge. What kind of treatment? It's called functional electrical stimulation combined with intensive neural pathway rehabilitation. Essentially, we use targeted electrical impulses to stimulate her muscles while retraining her brain to communicate with her spinal cord. The success rates are still being studied, but early results are encouraging. Richard felt the familiar surge of hope followed immediately by the crushing weight of reality. What would it involve? 6 months of intensive treatment in Baltimore. Emma would need to be at the facility 4 days a week, with specialized housing nearby. The program requires a parent or guardian to be present throughout the entire process. It's not something that can be managed remotely. 6 months. Baltimore. Richard's mind immediately jumped to board meetings, acquisition deadlines, the empire he'd built that demanded his constant attention. For 42 years, his identity had been wrapped up in being indispensable to his company. I'll need to think about logistics, Richard said automatically, already calculating how to manage the business from a distance. Of course. But Mr. Blackwood, I want to be clear about something. This window won't stay open indefinitely. Emma's neuroplasticity is at its peak right now. If we're going to try this, it needs to be soon. After hanging up, Richard sat in his leather chair, staring at the family photo that now held a place of honor on his desk. Claire smiled back at him, holding baby Emma, both of them trusting him to make the right choices for their family. The board meeting that afternoon felt surreal. Richard listened to discussions about market expansion and profit margins, while his mind was occupied with treatment schedules and the possibility of Emma walking again. When his CFO asked about his availability for the international acquisitions planned for early spring, Richard surprised everyone, including himself. I'll be taking an extended leave starting next month, he announced, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was saying. Margaret will coordinate with the executive team to manage operations remotely. The silence around the mahogany conference table was deafening. Richard Blackwood didn't take leaves. He'd worked through Claire's funeral, through Emma's initial hospitalization, through every crisis, personal and professional, that had touched his life. For how long? His business partner James asked carefully. 6 months, possibly longer. Richard stood, his decision crystallizing with each word. My daughter needs me, and for the first time in 2 years, I'm going to be the father she deserves, instead of just the businessman who pays her bills. That evening, Richard found Emma and Vanessa in the therapy room, working on a new routine that incorporated music therapy with strengthening exercises. Emma was laughing as she attempted to coordinate arm movements with supported leg lifts, her concentration absolute but joyful. Emma, can we talk? Richard asked, settling into the chair Vanessa kept for him during sessions. Emma's face grew serious, the expression of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of disappointment or bad news. Dr. Harrison called today. There's a special program that might help your legs get stronger, Richard began, choosing his words carefully. But it would mean moving to Baltimore for 6 months. Lots of therapy, lots of hard work, and no guarantees about the results. Emma's eyes widened. Would I be able to walk? We don't know, Richard said honestly. But you might get some feeling back in your legs. You might be able to stand for longer periods. The doctors think you have a good chance of improving, but it would be the hardest thing you've ever done. Emma looked at Vanessa, then back at her father. Would you come with me? Every single day, Richard promised, reaching for her hand. I would work from Baltimore, and we'd be together through all of it. What about Vanessa? Emma asked, the question Richard had been afraid to voice himself. Vanessa knelt beside Emma's wheelchair, her heart racing as she realized how much this family had come to mean to her. If your father agrees, and if you want me there, I'd love to be part of your journey. Emma's smile could have powered the entire mansion. Yes, I want to try. I want to dance again, even if it's different from before. Richard looked at these two remarkable women who'd taught him that love wasn't about control but about showing up, day after day, for the people who mattered most. Then we're going to Baltimore, all three of us. That night, as Richard made the phone calls that would restructure his entire life, informing Dr. Harrison of their decision, arranging for extended housing in Baltimore, delegating responsibilities he'd never trusted to anyone else, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, excitement about the future. Emma was getting a chance to heal. Vanessa would be there to guide them through the challenges ahead, and for the first time since Claire's death, Richard was choosing his family over his fear. The businessman who'd built an empire was finally ready to build something more important, a life worth living. The furnished apartment on Charles Street felt impossibly small after the sprawling Boston mansion, but it buzzed with an energy that had been missing from their lives for years. Richard stood at the kitchen window, watching Baltimore's morning rush hour while mentally preparing for Emma's first full evaluation at Johns Hopkins. In just 3 weeks, their entire world had shifted, and somehow, it felt more like home than anywhere they'd lived since Claire died. "Daddy, I can't find my lucky socks," Emma called from her temporary bedroom, where Vanessa was helping her prepare for what would be the most important medical appointment of her young life. "The ones with the dancing bears?" Richard called back, amazed at how natural these domestic conversations had become. In Boston, their interactions had been scheduled, formal, filtered through caregivers and protocols. Here, necessity had stripped away the barriers that had kept them strangers in their own home. "Found them," Vanessa announced, emerging from the bedroom with Emma freshly dressed and radiating nervous excitement. Someone hid them in her therapy bag. Richard smiled, remembering how he'd tucked the socks away the night before after Emma mentioned they made her feel brave. The old Richard would have dismissed such sentiment as illogical. This Richard, the one who'd learned that love often lived in gestures too, small for spreadsheets to measure, understood that courage sometimes came in unexpected packages. The drive to Johns Hopkins took 20 minutes through neighborhoods Richard had never noticed during his previous business trips to Baltimore. Emma pointed out details from her car seat: a dog walker juggling 6 leashes, a street musician drawing crowds despite the early hour, children walking to school with backpacks nearly as large as they were. "Look how many people are starting their day," Emma observed with the wisdom of someone who'd learned not to take any day for granted. "I wonder what they're hoping for." Vanessa caught Richard's eye in the rearview mirror. In Boston, Emma had spent months staring out windows at a world she felt disconnected from. Here, she was engaging with life again, finding wonder in ordinary moments that had previously felt impossible to reach. Dr. Sarah Chen greeted them in the pediatric rehabilitation wing, with the kind of warm professionalism that immediately put both Richard and Emma at ease. At 45, she'd spent her career working with children facing impossible challenges, and her office walls were covered with photos of former patients, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers, some standing independently, all smiling with the particular radiance of children who'd fought for every victory. "Emma, I've been reading about your progress in Boston," Dr. Chen began, settling into a chair positioned at Emma's eye level rather than behind an intimidating desk. "Your team there speaks very highly of your determination." Emma straightened, in her wheelchair, pride replacing nervousness. "Vanessa taught me that therapy doesn't have to feel like punishment. We dance while we exercise." "I'd love to see that," Dr. Chen said, immediately earning Emma's trust. "But first, let's talk about what we're hoping to accomplish here." The next hour involved detailed explanations of the experimental protocol, realistic discussions of potential outcomes, and careful examination of Emma's current mobility. Richard took notes with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers, but his focus had shifted from controlling variables to understanding possibilities. The functional electrical stimulation will feel strange at first, Dr. Chen explained to Emma, showing her the specialized equipment they'd be using. It's like tickling your muscles into remembering how to work. Some children describe it as feeling like gentle lightning. Emma giggled at the description, her fear dissolving into curiosity. Will it hurt? Not hurt exactly, but it might feel overwhelming sometimes. That's why the first month is about getting used to the sensations and building up your tolerance, gradually. Richard watched his daughter process this information with remarkable maturity, asking thoughtful questions about the timeline and what would be expected of her. This was the same child who'd been silent and withdrawn just months earlier, and her transformation filled him with hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. The apartment they returned to that afternoon felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighted by uncertainty. Richard had set up a temporary office in the second bedroom, complete with video conferencing equipment that would keep him connected to his Boston team. But for the first time in his career, work felt secondary to the larger project of rebuilding their family. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the compact kitchen, Emma asked the question that had been hovering over all their carefully laid plans. Vanessa, what happens after the 6 months? Her voice was small but determined to face whatever answer came. Do you go back to Boston and find another family to help? Vanessa's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping for their salad. She'd been dreading this conversation, unsure how to explain that somewhere between Emma's first laugh and Richard's first genuine smile, she'd stopped being their employee and started becoming something much more complicated. Richard sat down, his laptop, realizing that Emma had voiced the fear that had been keeping him awake at night. In just 3 months, Vanessa had become essential to their happiness in ways that had nothing to do with her nursing qualifications. She was the bridge between his logical mind and Emma's emotional needs, the translator who helped them understand each other, the steady presence that made both of them braver than they'd ever been alone. I don't know, Vanessa admitted honestly, settling onto the couch beside Emma's wheelchair. What happens depends on what you both want, and what I want too. Emma's directness cut through all adult hesitation. What do you want? Vanessa looked at these two people who'd become her family, her heart racing as she prepared to risk everything on the truth. I want to stay, not as your nurse or your employee, but as someone who loves you both and wants to be part of whatever comes next. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility rather than uncertainty. Richard studied Vanessa's face, seeing not just the professional caregiver who'd saved his daughter, but the woman who'd taught him how to be a father again, who'd challenged his need for control, and shown him that love required vulnerability rather than strength. We want you to stay too, Emma announced, speaking for both of them with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the most important truths were usually the simplest ones. Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotions he was finally learning to express. The question isn't whether we want you here, Vanessa. The question is whether you're ready to be part of a family that's still figuring out how to be whole again. That night, as Baltimore settled into darkness around their small apartment, the three of them made plans that had nothing to do with therapy schedules or medical protocols. They talked about Christmas traditions they wanted to create, about Emma's hopes for middle school, about the possibility of getting a dog once Emma's mobility improved. For the first time since Claire's death, Richard fell asleep thinking about the future, rather than mourning the past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult therapy sessions, and the hard work of rebuilding Emma's connection to her own body. But tonight, their improvised family was complete, and that was miracle enough to sustain them through whatever came next. Emma's lucky socks were carefully placed on the dresser, ready for another day of hoping for the impossible and believing it might just be within reach. 4 months into the Johns Hopkins program, Emma had surprised everyone, including herself. The electrical stimulation treatments that had initially felt overwhelming were now routine, and her legs had begun responding in ways that defied even Dr. Chen's carefully optimistic projections. She could stand independently for nearly 10 minutes, take supported steps with specialized braces, and most remarkably, had regained sensation in both feet. The transformation went beyond the physical. Emma had found her voice again, not just literally, but emotionally. She'd made friends with other children in the program, including 7-year-old Marcus, who was relearning to walk after a brain tumor, and 9-year-old Sophia, whose spina bifida hadn't stopped her from becoming the program's unofficial cheerleader. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Chen called Richard into her office after Emma's afternoon session. "I wanted to discuss something special we're organizing for next month." Richard looked up from his laptop where he'd been balancing quarterly reports with Emma's therapy schedule. Working remotely had initially felt like professional suicide, but he'd discovered that stepping back from day-to-day operations had actually improved his company's performance. His team had risen to fill the leadership gap, and his strategic oversight from Baltimore had proven more valuable than his Boston micromanagement. "We're organizing an adaptive dance recital for our pediatric patients," Dr. Chen continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's part of our holistic approach to rehabilitation, showing these children that their bodies can create beauty as well as function. Emma's progress makes her an ideal candidate." Richard's breath caught. "Dancing? But she's only been walking short distances with support." "That's exactly the point," Dr. Chen smiled. "Adaptive dance isn't about traditional choreography, it's about expression, creativity, and proving that art has no limitations. Some performers will be in wheelchairs, others using walkers, some standing with support. The beauty is in the courage, not the perfection." That evening, Richard found Emma and Vanessa in their apartment's living room, which had been transformed into an impromptu therapy space. Emma was practicing standing exercises while Vanessa spotted her, both of them moving to the classical music that had become the soundtrack of Emma's recovery. Dr. Chen mentioned a dance recital, Richard said carefully, settling into the chair that had become his designated spot for these evening sessions. Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "She asked if I wanted to perform. Can I, Daddy? Please?" The old Richard would have immediately cataloged the risks: potential falls, public embarrassment, the possibility of failure in front of an audience. The new Richard saw something different, his daughter's eyes sparkling with hope for the first time since before the accident. "What would you want to perform?" he asked, already knowing his answer but wanting to hear hers. "Something for Mommy," Emma said without hesitation. "Something that shows her I kept my promise to keep dancing, even though it looks different now." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. Over the past 4 months, she'd watched Richard transform from a man paralyzed by fear into a father who led with love. She'd seen Emma evolve from a silent, withdrawn child into a brave young girl who faced each challenge with determination. But more than that, she'd felt herself becoming part of something she'd never expected to find. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and commitment. "I have an idea," Vanessa said softly. "What if we created something together? Not just for the recital, but for us. A way to honor your mom and celebrate how far we've all come." The next 3 weeks became a blur of secret rehearsals, adaptive choreography, and costume planning. Emma worked with Dr. Chen to ensure every movement was medically safe while maximizing her newfound abilities. Vanessa researched adaptive dance techniques, collaborating with the hospital's music therapist to create a performance that would showcase Emma's progress without pushing beyond her limits. Richard found himself involved in ways he'd never imagined, helping design a costume that would accommodate Emma's braces, recording music mixes that matched her movement capabilities, even learning basic spotting techniques so he could support her during more challenging sequences. The night before the recital, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling of their temporary home, her mind racing with excitement and terror in equal measure. "Daddy?" she called softly. Richard appeared in her doorway within seconds, as he had every night since they'd arrived, in Baltimore. "Can't sleep, sweetheart? What if I fall tomorrow? What if I can't do the routine? What if everyone sees that I'm still broken?" Richard sat on the edge of her bed, his heart breaking for the 8-year-old who'd been forced to carry such adult fears. "Emma, You're not broken. You're different than you were before the accident, but you're not broken. You're one of the bravest people I know. But what if? Then we'll figure it out together. Richard interrupted gently. Vanessa and I will be right there with you, and if you fall, we'll help you get back up. And if you can't finish the routine, we'll be proud of you for trying. There's no way you can disappoint us tomorrow because you've already given us more than we ever dreamed possible. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud? Richard's throat constricted with emotion, but his voice was steady when he answered. I think Mommy would be amazed by the strong, determined, beautiful young lady you've become. I think she'd be proud that you found a way to keep dancing even when everything changed. And I think she'd love knowing that you have Vanessa to help you through the hard parts. The next evening, the Johns Hopkins Auditorium filled with families, medical staff, and community members who'd come to witness something extraordinary. Richard sat in the front row, his hands gripping the program that listed Emma's performance, Dancing with Angels, in memory of Claire Blackwood. When the lights dimmed and Emma appeared on stage, Richard's breath stopped entirely. She wore a flowing lavender dress that moved beautifully even from her wheelchair, and her face glowed with the same joy he remembered from before the accident. Vanessa stood beside her, dressed in complementary blue, ready to support Emma through the routine they'd created together. The music began, a gentle arrangement of Angel by Sarah McLachlan that built slowly into something triumphant. Emma started the routine in her wheelchair, her arms creating graceful patterns that told a story of loss and hope. Halfway through, with Vanessa's careful support, she transferred to standing position, her legs trembling with effort but holding strong. What followed was 3 minutes of pure magic. Emma moved with supported steps, her arms flowing like water, her face radiant with joy and determination. When she stumbled slightly during a turn, Vanessa was there instantly, incorporating the moment into the choreography so seamlessly that it looked intentional. The routine culminated with Emma standing independently for 30 seconds, arms raised toward the ceiling, while Vanessa knelt beside her in a pose that spoke of protection and love. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Richard cried openly, as did most of the audience. But these weren't tears of pity or sadness. They were tears of awe at witnessing a child who'd refused to let tragedy define her limits. After the performance, as they gathered backstage, Emma threw her arms around both Richard and Vanessa. Did you see? I danced for Mommy. She saw, Richard whispered, holding his daughter close. And she was so proud. But as the evening wound down and they prepared to return to their apartment, Richard realized something had shifted. Watching Emma perform, seeing her courage and Vanessa's devotion, witnessing the family they'd become, he understood that their time in Baltimore wasn't just about Emma's physical recovery. It was about all of them learning how to build something new from the pieces of what they'd lost. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, clutching her program and the bouquet of flowers the audience had given her, Richard found Vanessa on their small balcony, staring out at Baltimore's skyline. Thank you, he said simply, settling beside her in the chair that had become theirs during these quiet evening conversations. For what? For giving us back our lives. For teaching us how to be a family again. For loving us even when we didn't know how to love ourselves. Vanessa turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the city lights and something deeper. Hope, love, and the kind of contentment that came from finding where you belonged. Richard, she said softly, her heart racing with the magnitude of what she was about to say. These 4 months have been the happiest of my life, not because of the progress Emma's made, though that's been incredible, but because of who we've become together. I love you, both of you, and I want to spend the rest of my life being part of this family we've created. Richard's answer came without hesitation, born from months of watching this remarkable woman heal, his daughter and his own broken heart. I love you too, more than I thought I could love anyone again. And I want to build a future with you. Not because Emma needs you, though she does, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of Emma's treatment, decisions about returning to Boston, and the complex logistics of building a permanent life together. But tonight, on a small balcony overlooking a city that had given them back their hope, Richard Blackwood finally understood that the strongest foundations weren't built on control or fear, but on love, trust, and the courage to let other people matter more than your own safety. The April morning when they returned to Boston felt like stepping into a different life entirely. The mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum now buzzed with contractors, painters, and the joyful chaos of renovation. Richard had spent the final month in Baltimore orchestrating not just Emma's medical transition, but a complete transformation of the home that would welcome their new beginning. Gone were the sterile white walls and cold marble surfaces that had reflected his grief for 2 years. In their place, warm earth tones and soft textures created spaces designed for living, rather than merely existing. The mansion now featured wheelchair-accessible bathways throughout, but more importantly, it felt like a place where laughter belonged. Emma's reaction was everything Richard had hoped for and more. "Daddy, it's beautiful," she exclaimed from her wheelchair as they toured the renovated spaces. Her new bedroom featured a hospital-grade adjustable bed disguised as a princess canopy, adaptive technology seamlessly integrated into whimsical decor, and most importantly, a dance space with specialized flooring and safety equipment where she could continue her therapeutic routines. But it was the main living area that brought tears to all their eyes. The formal sitting room where they'd once eaten silent dinners had been transformed into an open family space. Claire's photos adorned the walls, not hidden away as painful reminders, but celebrated as the foundation of love that had made this moment possible. A piano occupied one corner, waiting for Emma to relearn her interrupted lessons. Adaptive furniture allowed Emma to move freely between her wheelchair and other seating, participating fully in family life rather than accommodating it. "Look," Emma pointed to the centerpiece of the room, a professional-grade dance floor with ceiling-mounted support systems that would allow her to practice safely as her strength continued improving. "I can keep dancing here." Vanessa squeezed Richard's hand as they watched Emma explore her new environment with wonder, rather than the tentative fear that had characterized her relationship with their home for so long. The past 6 months had transformed all of them, but seeing Emma's joy in this moment crystallized just how far they'd traveled from the broken family that had first arrived in Baltimore. The Johns Hopkins doctors had been cautiously optimistic about Emma's continued progress. Her sensation had returned to roughly 60% of normal. She could walk independently for short distances with her braces, and most remarkably, she'd developed what Dr. Chen called adaptive confidence, the understanding that her worth wasn't determined by her physical limitations. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Chen had said during their final consultation, "Emma's recovery has exceeded our most optimistic projections. But more than that, she's developed psychological resilience that will serve her throughout her life. Whatever challenges she faces going forward, she has the tools to adapt and thrive." Those words echoed in Richard's mind as he watched Emma demonstrate her improved mobility for Margaret, who had flown down from Boston to oversee the mansion's transformation and witness the family's homecoming. "Sir, if I may," Margaret said quietly as Emma worked with Vanessa on unpacking her Baltimore treasures, "you've become the father she always needed you to be, and the man your wife would be proud of." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Claire's presence felt especially strong today, not as a painful absence but as a loving spirit who had somehow orchestrated this second chance for her family. The afternoon brought visitors Richard had been both anticipating and dreading, his business partners and board members arriving for what they assumed would be a routine transition meeting to discuss his return to full-time leadership. Richard had other plans. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling into the head of the conference table he'd had installed in his home office, a symbolic gesture that work would now accommodate family rather than the reverse. "I wanted to discuss the future direction of Blackwood Technologies and my role going forward." James Morton, his longtime business partner, leaned forward expectantly. "We're thrilled to have you back full-time, Richard. The remote arrangement worked well temporarily, But we need your hands-on leadership to pursue the expansion opportunities we've identified. Richard looked around the table at men and women who had been his professional family for over a decade, people who'd supported his company through Claire's death and Emma's accident without question. They deserved honesty about the changes that had transformed him during these months away. "Actually, I won't be returning to full-time leadership," Richard announced calmly. "The remote arrangement isn't temporary, it's permanent. I'm restructuring my role to focus on strategic oversight and major decision-making, but the day-to-day operations will remain delegated to the excellent team we've developed." The silence was deafening. Richard Blackwood didn't delegate. He didn't trust others. With his empire, he certainly didn't choose family over profit margins. "Richard," James said carefully, "I understand that Emma's treatment has been demanding, but now that you're back—" "I'm not back to the person I was," Richard interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm back as a better version of myself. One who understands that building a successful company means nothing if you destroy your family in the process. Emma needs me present, not just physically but emotionally, and I need to be the father she deserves, not the workaholic who was too busy to notice her needs." Margaret smiled proudly from her position near the window, remembering the man who'd once reviewed email during Emma's bedtime stories and comparing him to the father who now read to his daughter every night without any electronic devices in sight. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Richard methodically addressing concerns and restructuring responsibilities. By the end, even his most skeptical board members had to admit that his strategic guidance combined with distributed leadership might actually strengthen the company's long-term prospects. As evening approached, and the business discussions concluded, the mansion filled with a different energy entirely. Vanessa had prepared Emma's favorite dinner, adaptations of recipes they'd discovered during their Baltimore adventure, modified for their Boston kitchen but retaining the flavors that had become symbols of their healing. "Daddy," Emma said as they gathered around the dining table that had been lowered to accommodate her wheelchair, but designed to include everyone equally, "I have something important to ask you." Richard and Vanessa exchanged glances, both wondering what profound question their thoughtful 8-year-old had formulated now. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emma's face grew serious with the weight of her request. "When you marry Vanessa, can I be the flower girl? And can we have dancing at the wedding even if mine looks different from everyone else's?" The question hung in the air like a prayer made audible. Richard felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed to encompass everything good and hopeful about their future. "Emma," Vanessa said softly, kneeling beside her chair, "your daddy hasn't asked me to marry him yet." Emma's eyes widened with 8-year-old horror at this oversight. "Daddy, you have to ask her properly, with a ring and everything." Richard laughed, the deep, genuine laughter that had returned to his life along with everything else Emma and Vanessa had restored. "You're absolutely right. I've been planning this for weeks, but I was waiting for the perfect moment." He stood from the table, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket for the small velvet box he'd been carrying since their last week in Baltimore. The ring inside had belonged to Claire, not her engagement ring, which he'd preserved for Emma, but a smaller band she'd worn daily, now reset with diamonds to create something that honored the past while celebrating the future. "Vanessa Rodriguez," Richard said, dropping to one knee beside her chair as Emma clapped her hands in delight. "You saved my daughter's life, but more than that, you saved mine. You taught us how to be a family again. You showed us that love isn't about controlling the people you care about. It's about trusting them enough to let them transform you." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the man who'd become her anchor, her partner, her choice for building the life she'd always dreamed of, but never expected to find. "You've made me braver, kinder, and more myself than I've ever been," Richard continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Will you marry me? Will you officially become Emma's mother and my wife, and help us build whatever comes next?" "Yes," Vanessa whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, Emma cheered from her wheelchair, already planning reception details and flower arrangements with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that the best celebrations honored both where you'd been and where you were going. That evening, as Boston settled into spring twilight around their transformed home, the three of them found themselves in Emma's new dance space. Music played softly, not the clinical therapy sessions of months past, but the joyful expression of a family that had learned to move together through whatever challenges life presented. Emma stood between Richard and Vanessa, her hands in theirs. For support, all three of them swaying to music that spoke of love, loss, healing, and hope. Her steps were careful but confident, her laughter bright and unforced, her movements a perfect metaphor for their journey from brokenness to wholeness. "I'm dancing with both my parents," Emma announced with satisfaction, as if this moment had always been inevitable rather than miraculous. Richard looked at his daughter, brave, resilient, filled with joy despite everything she'd endured, and at Vanessa, the woman who taught them both that strength came not from rigid control, but from vulnerable openness to love and change. Outside, spring was transforming Boston's landscape, bringing new life to places that had seemed permanently frozen. Inside the mansion that had once felt like a tomb, three people who'd learned to trust in second chances danced together in the gathering dusk, their movements a celebration of everything they'd survived and everything they'd chosen to build, from the beautiful wreckage of their former lives. The dance would continue tomorrow and the day after that, and for all the years to come, sometimes graceful, sometimes stumbling, always together, always moving toward whatever music life would play for them next. And in the photographs that would eventually fill their walls, in the memories they would create in this house that had learned to hold joy again, in the laughter that would echo through these halls for decades to come, Claire's spirit would live on, not as a ghost of the past, but as the foundation of love that had made this new beginning possible. Emma's promise had been kept. She had continued dancing, even when it looked different than anyone had imagined. And in keeping that promise, she had taught her father and her new mother that the most beautiful choreography of all was the one you created together, step by step, with trust and hope, and the courage to let love lead the way.